Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here this evening. Can I take this out? Make it a little less awkward. All right, good evening. My name is Dr. Erica Kidd. I'm the director of the CSMA program here at the University of St. Thomas, and it's a pleasure to see you all here this evening, old faces and new faces. I want to welcome you to the 2018 Catholic Thought and Culture, CSMA Thought and Culture Lecture. Welcome to our alumni, welcome to our current students, and also a very special welcome to some prospective Catholic Studies students and their families who are here with us tonight. It's really, really wonderful to have you here. So many of you are familiar with the good work that we do here in Catholic Studies, and in the CSMA program in particular. But for those of you who are just getting to know us, let me say that the CSMA program is a Christ-centered exploration of 2 millennia of Catholic thought and culture. It's an interdisciplinary program, but one thing that makes our interdisciplinary program unique is that we have a center of integration, and that center is Christ. Jesus Christ's incarnation as a human being in time and history is the lens through which we understand and make sense of all that we study. Christ is all and in all, and we seek to find and know him across the disciplines and across the centuries. My colleague, Dr. David Foote, and I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, but my colleague, Dr. David Foote, has a beautiful metaphor for describing what we do in Catholic studies, and it's a metaphor of learning a new language or developing our capacity to speak well. It works something like this. This deep dive into the Catholic tradition helps each one of us recover a language for articulating the full reality of the human person and the world. Our task is to recover an integrated sense of the whole, and we do that through learning new forms of articulation. As our students deepen their vocabulary, they find richer and deeper ways of understanding their own stories. So this evening's lecture is on Dante, as you know. The title of the lecture is Why Dante Matters, beginning at the end. And Dante is surely one of those great figures of the tradition who has offered many of us new terms, new ways of understanding ourselves, and expanded vocabulary. Dante helps us discover rich ways of understanding ourselves, our world, our predicament, and our hope. I hope it won't get me fired to say this, but we actually call him Saint Dante around our house, which I know is not strictly kosher, but we do it anyway. So the first treat of this evening is just to say you get to hear a lecture on Dante, which is a big treat. But the second treat of the evening is that our speaker is my colleague, Dr. Billy Junker. Dr. Junker is Associate Professor of Catholic Studies, co-director of the Murphy Institute for Thought, Law, and Public Policy. He has degrees in philosophy and English from the University of Dallas and from Notre Dame, and his doctorate is from the Commedia on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Dr. Junker writes and publishes primarily on English Renaissance literature. But you all know, or many of you know, that Dr. Junker is also a tremendously gifted teacher who has done much over the years to help undergraduates and graduate students begin to see how Dante's journey towards salvation can be an aid to all of us who seek happiness and holiness. Dr. Junker is an attentive and careful reader of the text and also a really enthusiastic one. I've lost track of the number of times that he has burst into my office to tell me something about Mary's womb, and it was always very insightful. So as I said, it's going to be a real treat, and I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Junker.
Okay. There's going to be an accident. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Kidd, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you, Jessica Zitlow, for setting this up and putting up with me, not only in relation to this event, but other events that I'm a hard person to work with, and I also would like to thank my wife for putting up with me because I'm a harder person to live with than I am to work with, by a long stretch. So, let's begin. Behind the poem that is Dante's Commedia is the visionary journey undertaken by Dante himself. The purpose of Dante's spiritual vision, in fact, is to enable him to write the poem that recounts it. And the purpose of the poem that he writes is the spiritual transformation of its readers. One of the difficult things about the Commedia, however, is that none of this becomes very clear until the last few cantos of Paradiso, which is also the third and final canticle of Dante's poem. As a result, first-time readers of the Commedia must make it all the way down through hell, the Inferno, all the way up the mountain of purgatory, Purgatorio, and most of the way through the heavens, the Paradiso, before they are in a position to see what is really going on in the poem. Even then, however, and this is another difficult thing about the Commedia, there are lots of them, what it is that is really going on is still not that easy to see and is never actually spelled out. Rather, the meaning and purpose of the Commedia are revealed gradually and indirectly by hints and patterns and guesses. This is the way of all good poetry, and more generally, it is the way of all texts that are written not to be read, but to be repeatedly reread. But it poses a real impediment for the first time, non-academic, casual, or potentially casual reader of Dante's poem. So in my talk this evening, I want to flesh out the claim I made just now about the relationship between Dante's vision and his Commedia, and Dante's Commedia and us, its readers. By beginning with the end, which is to say the purpose of the Commedia itself, I hope to introduce the Commedia in a way that makes you want to read the poem, if you have not, and to read the poem again, if you already have. I want to begin by taking a look at a passage near the end of the Commedia, in Canto 25 of the Paradiso. This is not the passage that you have. That's even closer to the end. That actually is the end. We'll get to the end at the end. By this point in his journey, Dante has traversed with Virgil the entirety of hell and purgatory and has ascended with Beatrice through the 7 heavenly spheres of the planets, the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, in that order. He now finds himself in the 8th celestial sphere, the ambit of the fixed stars or constellations. There he has witnessed the heavenly pageant of the Church Triumphant, culminating in the angelic crowning of Mary as Empress of Heaven, and has just finished his discussion with the Apostle Peter, who has tested and confirmed Dante's faith. In Canto 25, Dante has a similar encounter with the Apostle James, this time focused on the virtue of hope. And in the next canto, he will meet the Apostle John, who will look into Dante's love. Near the beginning of Dante's discussion with James, the apostle offers a profound revelation of the providential intent behind Dante's vision. And it is this revelation I want to consider, and I'll read it. The apostle states, "Our emperor, in his grace, wills that before your death you confront his counts in the innermost chamber, so that, having seen the truth of this court, you may strengthen the hope of it, which makes folk love well down there, in yourself and others." On James' account, Dante is given the special privilege of seeing the truth of the heavenly court as it appears in its innermost chamber, so that he may strengthen the hope of it in himself and in others after returning to earth. The importance of the virtue of hope, moreover, is that it teaches those who possess it how to love well. What it means to love well is to love everything that is good, everything that exists, in other words, for being and goodness are convertible, for Dante, and to love it with an intensity proportionate to its goodness. To love well is therefore to love God as intensely as you can, for God's own goodness is the infinite and inexhaustible source of the goodness of creation and everything within it. It is to love your neighbor as intensely as yourself, as one made in the image and likeness of God, and as sharing in the Spirit of Christ. It is to love your husband, wife, children, relations, friends, colleagues, and fellow citizens with a special duty and care warranted by the goodness inherent in each of these relationships. It is to love natural goods like sex, food, and beer, which you thought was angelic, but it is just natural, with much less intensity than you love persons, and to love conventional goods like money and status with even less intensity than these. To love well is finally not to love the evils that befall other human beings, even though pride or envy or wrath might sometimes tempt you to do so. In Dante's Commedia, the realm of purgatory is the school where one learns how to love well. And those of you familiar with the second canticle of Dante's poem might have perceived in my description of loving well an outline of the structure of purgatory as a whole, roughly. And you would not be wrong. The point I want to stress now, however, is the relationship between hope and loving well, revealed by the apostle. For it turns out that the virtue of hope can teach us how to love well down here, on the earth, in this life. If so, then hope would not only give us a better chance of testing out of purgatory, as it were, but might also, and for Dante much more importantly, make our common social world a little less like the living hell it so often resembles. Hell, after all, is what the world becomes as soon as hope is abandoned. As the inscription on the gates of hell in Inferno 3 informs us, you abandon every hope who enter here. This damning connection, badum-ching, is first established even earlier than this. It is in fact the hinge on which the entire narrative of the Commedia swings open. For the very moment when Dante, unable to overcome his fear of the she-wolf, abandons every hope of reaching the heights, and that's a quote, and as a consequence begins, and here's another quote, falling down into a low place. This is the very moment that Mary intervenes, opening the real action of the poem by setting in motion a chain of events that leads to Virgil suddenly showing up to break Dante's fall. The Commedia is a comedy and not a tragedy because it is the poetic record of a spiritual journey begun in and secured by hope. Not, at least at the beginning, Dante's hope, to be sure, but Mary's hope for Dante. Indeed, if we were to jump ahead a bit at this point, say from the first canto of the Commedia to its very last, Canto 33 of Paradiso, we would discover that Mary's hope for Dante not only intervenes to begin his journey, but also intervenes to bring it to its happy end. This end being the moment when Dante is finally given to know the truth he has come to hope for, and this truth sets him free. Unfortunately, however, we are not in a position to make this jump right now. We first need to return to Paradiso 25 and the passage with which this talk began. So, to sum up, recall that, according to the Apostle James, the purpose of Dante's mystical vision of the truth is to strengthen the hope of others not graced with such a vision, thereby making them better lovers of God and of each other. These three terms, truth, hope, and love, are closely interrelated, and it will be helpful to sketch out how. The truth that Dante is given to know in the Empyrean, this being the highest and innermost court of heaven. This truth is the same good that we, here on earth, hope one day to attain. By hoping for this good and not another, we train our will and desire to pursue it more intensely than other goods, and to pursue other goods only insofar as they help us obtain this one. And this is just what it means to love well. Assuming, of course, that the good for which we hope is the highest good, rather, goodness itself, aka God. To hope for any good other than God is, on Dante's understanding, not really to hope at all. He knows this from experience, having once placed his own hope, in all sorts of things, including, and I am not making this up, a female leopard with a fashionable jacket. But it turns out, so Dante comes to be convinced, that only goodness itself can fully satisfy our will and our desire. Only it can make us happy, in other words. As a result, only this goodness, only God, can serve as the principle in relation to which other goods can be rightly ordered, and as a result, well loved by us. In the Commedia, the classic scriptural expression of hope is David's 9th Psalm, which is unsurprisingly quoted twice in the course of Dante's discussion with James in this same Canto 25 of Paradiso. Asked by the apostle how he first learned to hope, Dante answers, "From many stars this light of hope comes to me, but he who first distilled it in my heart was the highest singer of the highest Lord. Let them hope in thee," he says in his divine song, "those who know thy name." To hope at all, then, for Dante and the psalmist, whose words he makes his own, is to hope only in and for God. But as so often is the case with Dante, there is an added wrinkle in the account of hope he provides in this canto that, rather than detracting from the virtue's conventional or orthodox understanding, considerably enriches and enlivens that understanding. The wrinkle comes in the form of Dante's citation of another quotation in this canto, one that might appear to conflict with the plain meaning of David the psalmist's assertion, that this assertion being that we hope only in thee, O God. This other quotation is taken from a book entitled the sentences. It has a small readership, but a very elite one, relatively speaking. The sentences, which was used as a kind of training manual in university theology for several centuries. And it is the sentences, Peter Lombard's sentences, that Dante appeals to when he is asked by James to define the hope he claims to possess. Hope, I said, is a sure expectation of the future glory produced by God's grace and preceding merit. If the object of our hope can only be God, then how can hope also be defined as a sure expectation of the future glory? And what does that even mean? Let's take up these questions in reverse order. The future glory, Dante will later explain, is a shorthand expression for certain prophecies in Isaiah and the book of Revelation, which describe the final perfection of those souls whom God has made his friends, as Dante puts it. God's friends receive a new wardrobe. In Isaiah, it is a double raiment, which in Revelation becomes 2 white stoles. Dante understands both of these phrases to signify the glorified souls and bodies of the resurrected saints on the last day. To have a sure expectation of future glory, then, is to look forward to the true reality of your own transformation. To have a sure expectation of future glory is to look forward to the true reality of your own transformation, your own glorified self. We can now reformulate the first question in this way. Is a hope that seeks to attain one's true future glorified self the same as or different from a hope that seeks to attain God? The answer to this question, if there is one, I will suggest there's one in the comedy, does not arrive until the last few lines of the poem. And there is a good reason for the delay. For according to the Apostle James, it is not until Dante sees the truth of this court that he will be able to strengthen, here on earth, our hope for the same. But Dante does not begin to see the fullness of the truth he sees until, in Paradiso 33, he begins to contemplate God himself. Until we arrive at this canto of the poem, then, we cannot really say what truth it is that Dante sees. And so we cannot know, by the same token, what our hope should really be a hope for. For the truth that Dante sees just is the good for which we are to hope. What truth is it, then, that Dante sees? Here's what the poem says. And now, the handout. Which I produced myself, so there's probably errors on it. And of course, I lost mine. My students are very familiar with these kinds of events. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. O eternal light. And I should say these are the closing lines of the Paradiso, lines 124 to 145. O eternal light, who throne only within yourself, solely know yourself, and known by yourself, and knowing, love and smile. That circulation, which seemed in you to be generated like reflected light, surveyed by my eyes somewhat, within itself, in its very own color, seemed to me to be painted with our effigy, by which my sight was all absorbed. Like the geometer, who is all intent to square the circle and cannot find, for all his thought, the principle he lacks, such was I at that new sight. I wished to see how the image fitted the circle, and how it inwears itself there. But my own feathers were not sufficient for that, except that my mind was struck by a flash in which its desire came. Here my high imagining failed of power. But already, my desire and will were turned, like a wheel being moved evenly by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Any ideas about this? No. I want to draw our attention to just the last few of these lines, which relate the climactic and concluding moment of Dante's vision, when, in a sudden flash, Dante is given the grace to know a truth that up to this point in the poem, he had only been graced to believe. The truth in question is not just any truth, of course, but rather the first and, as it were, most fundamental truth. I mean, of course, the truth of the incarnation. Dante, he has very strong fascination with this truth, and it's made plain already in the second canto of Paradise, where the merely hypothetical union of his own body with the body of the moon, we find out later Dante is not actually rising in body. But he says, imagine I were rising in body, then I'd be joined to the moon. Wouldn't that be crazy? But then you should also want to think even more about the incarnation, because that's even crazier. Anyway, he puts it a little bit more subtly than I do. Anyway, the hypothetical union of his own body with the body of the moon leads him to meditate upon the certain, but more incredible, union of the divine and human natures in Christ. And this is Dante meditating upon his hypothetical embodiment in the moon, which happens not to be the case. If I was a body, and down here on earth, it cannot be conceived how one dimension could accept another, as must occur if a body coincide with the body. If this is true, if this was true, then it should kindle within us more desire to see that essence, where is seen, how. To see that essence, where is seen, how our nature and God were united. There we shall see that which we hold by faith, and we shall see it not by demonstration. No. But it will be self-evident, like the first truth one believes. In contemplating the divine essence, the blessed understand how our nature and God are made one in the person of Christ, in just the same way as we understand the first truth or principle of being. This is commonly known as the principle of non-contradiction. And this principle or truth, this first principle or truth of being, finds expression in the claim that, and I'm quoting Aquinas, quoting Aristotle, so this is a very Dante thing to do. It is impossible for the same attribute both to belong and not belong to the same subject at the same time and in the same manner. That is the first principle of being. The truth of this claim is self-evident, Aquinas proposes, to anyone who grasps the meaning of its terms. Now, it's a little bit difficult to grasp the meaning of its terms and what they're saying. So if you're struggling to see the self-evidence of this and you haven't been deformed by academic training, don't worry. The truth of the incarnation, which we can only affirm as an article of faith, is for Dante likewise self-evident to the blessed, who understand the mystery of its how, come, as immediately as we do the first principle of being. In most of the passage we have before us, however, and now I'm referring back again to the last lines of the poem, Dante presents himself as unable to discover this first truth in the divine essence. He does see our human effigy painted within the second circulation, the generated circle of reflected light that is the sun. But while his gaze is all absorbed by this new sight, he cannot reconcile the shape of the image with the shape of the circle upon which it is impressed. I wished, Dante explains in the passage we've read, to see how, come, the image came together with the circle, and how, come again, it enwears itself there. To put this in the language of Canto 2 of Paradiso, Dante wished to see how our nature and God are made one. But he instead finds that he is like the geometer who intends to square the circle, but cannot retrieve, for all his thought, the principle he lacks. To square a circle, Wikipedia will tell you, is to construct a square with the same area as a given circle by using only a finite number of steps with compass and straight edge. And it turns out to be impossible, owing to the peculiar features of the transcendental irrational number pi. At the end of the day, then, Dante's own intellectual desire, his own feathers, as he puts it, just can't lift him high enough to catch sight of this final truth. Except that, he writes, in what is surely one of the most startling and mysterious and undersold qualifications in the history of world literature. Except that my mind was struck by a flash in which its desire came. Simple as that. I'll tell you now, although I will not have the time to show, that Mary is actually the one behind this except that. This is the moment, in fact, where Mary's intervention completes the end of the journey in exactly the same way that her intervention begins the journey. Now, in and for the duration of this flash, which I imagine as striking his mind lightning-like from above, it's almost as though it were a replica of the Annunciation in a certain sense. Dante's desire to understand how the human image fits the divine circle, is consummated in one last fleeting vision. This flash imparts to Dante the fullness of the truth of his vision. And we know that this is so because upon the arrival of this flash, the vision itself comes to an end. Here, my high imagining failed of power. But what was the truth that the flash conveyed? And what desire of Dante's was finally realized upon its arrival? Perhaps it was this one. Dante, in the flash of a love stronger than his own, retrieved the principle that he lacked and discovered that this principle was in fact Dante's own human self, transformed into Christ's image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. 2 Corinthians 3:18. Dante and Paul are tight. In other words, we might say that midway through the journey of our life, Dante was returned to himself in a dark wood, and the good that he found there was Christ. So may we hope the same may be said for us. Thank you very much. Where am I supposed to go?
You stay right there. Is it on?
Is that all right? Are there questions, or am I allowed to say that?
No,
Okay, so.
I'm allowed to say that. But first of all, thank you.
Director.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. I'm sure there are questions, so Jessica is going to carry the microphone around, but what questions do you all have? Just raise your hand and Jessica will come to you.
Objections are good.
So my question is, I guess when I studied the Divine Comedy in college, we studied hell, and we studied maybe half of purgatory, and we got to like the first canto of the Paradiso.
Right.
And I think that's a pretty common experience, and I'm kind of regretting that now. And I'm wondering why a lot of professors seem to take that tack if the Paradiso kind of encapsulates everything.
Well, because, okay, great. If you're going to read only one canticle of the poem, in a way, I don't know, I would read like the last canto of Inferno and then Purgatorio. But the reason why that happens is because the poem is long and hard, and as you go through the poem actually gets harder. So there's lots of ways in which Paradiso is clearly the most difficult canticle of the poem. And you're also, right, hitting the most difficult part of the canticle of the poem at the same time that you're already behind schedule because everybody is behind schedule, and right, and now all of a sudden you're dealing with extremely ornate similes that depend upon a knowledge of 14th century astronomy, and it's very tempted just to say, I'm going to go back in my boat because I wasn't raised on angel's bread. Which Dante actually says. He says, at this point, you know, if you haven't been searching for the bread of wisdom since you've been young, you just might want to go back just try again later. And I mean, half my students, I mean, it's very funny. Because like, as a professor, in a way, I hate that Dante says that at that point in the poem, because my students are already wanting to go back. So once he tells them, like, they're just kind of like, we're just not ready to read this. Like, Dante, we just don't want to be damned. I mean, Dante says we're going to drown. So anyway, that's why. I think it's just, but actually I was thinking more about, like, it actually really is problematic if Inferno is the only thing you read, because Inferno is defined as the place where there is no hope. The only way that hope can get into Inferno is from the outside. And so if you only read the Inferno, right, you are getting a world that for Dante is defined precisely by the lack of what for Dante is I'm increasingly becoming convinced is what he thinks is the most important virtue of his day, and perhaps of ours, which is hope. And so you just are completely missing the whole point. So it's really, so that's why I said if you're going to read only one, I would read Purgatorio, because at least you get a sense of the actual true vision that Dante's interested in. Yeah. There's plenty of time, I think.
Hi, Dr. Junker.
Hi. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said that we can love things in proportion to their goodness, right? So we love God the most because he is the most good, or he is good. Mm-hmm. But we can only hope for things, we can only hope in God. So my question is, can we hope for earthly goods so long as they participate in God's greater goodness, or is that contrary to hope in a way that loving isn't? Does that make sense? Like, can we order our hope as if, like, we order our loves? Or does hope only exclusively apply to the divine?
In Dante, it applies to the divine. I don't know what the truth is. I'm just some dude. But in Dante, it definitely applies to the divine. Hope is always used in Dante as the condition for the possibility of being if you have hope, it's a sufficient condition for being in Purgatorio. Having faith is not, right? The world of hell is actually very faith-filled. But hope, like hope is used in precisely in the precise sense for Dante, that it is the hope for God that is the life in the soul, which means that the soul is not dead, which means that you are not damned.
Could you just elaborate on the comment that hell is very faithful?
There's lots of people who are in hell who are baptized Christians. Well, it's filled with I'll say it's faith filled if you think of their faith as a kind of like dead, rotting carcass. So there is no, as it were, living faith in hell. But that's because Dante understands living faith to be precisely hopeful faith. Living and hopefulness are almost equivalent terms in this technical sense in the comedy. To be alive is to have hope. To have hope is to be alive. That's why green is used for both. And it's a traditional thing.
Okay, I have a very simple question. Sorry. How do you actually enter into reading Dante? Because I'm trying to read it now, and I'm just struggling. Like, first of all, half the page is footnotes.
Where are you?
I'm on page,
Are you in the Inferno?
Yes, deep.
Okay.
And anyway, there's like half the page is often footnotes. I don't know if I should read those. And then even just
the experience of reading it, do you picture the scene he's setting, or do you read it slowly like poetry, or like how I always hear these talks and it's so beautiful and I'm fired up, and then when I open the book, it's like,
you know, Dante. Look, reading Dante is not a kind of fun and relaxing way to end your day. It's just not. Like, if you think, like, I'm going to read Dante, it's just, I'm just kick back and have a beer and just kind of rely and just really meditate. It's like, no. You're going to be like, who's this? What is that? I don't even understand where this sentence is going. I have no idea what's happening. Right? And then, I mean, you have to just understand, like, reading Dante is basically, especially reading Dante on your own, or in a group that's in a non-academic setting where you don't have someone who has been forced to read the damn poems, and the blessed poems, but has been forced to read it 8 times because he's had to teach it that many times, right? So if you're in a context where that does not hold, you have to just understand it's like training for a marathon. I mean, it's like that. It's like you're not going to want to do it some days. I don't know what else to say. I mean, it's just, I mean, I would say, let's say, since you're already in it, okay, I would go as fast as you need to go to get out of hell. And then when you get to purgatory, you could try to slow down again and try to pick up, right, and try to read a little bit more carefully. But I actually do think that there's one part of hell in particular that is just, even when I'm reading it, I'm just like, I just don't even want to, it's just, you get to a certain point in the Malabolgia, which is the level of simple fraud in all of its different varieties, and you just are kind of like, I don't care. It's all bad. I really don't care the exact way this thing is different from this thing. I mean, it doesn't matter. Let's just get down to Cocytus, and Satan is cool, but let's get out of here. So the other option is to look at certain cantos like closely, like the Ulysses canto in 26 of Inferno is something which needs to be read closely. The Canto 5, which is the Lustful, needs to be read closely, and the last canto of Inferno needs to be read very closely. But honestly, I think you can just kind of just go fast. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't want to.
On Dante's account, does it even make sense to say hope for something? If hope is in God and nothing else, is it hope for? Or is it just that is what hope is?
I think the best way to think about it is that hope is a stance that one assumes in relation to God. Hope is not God. Hope is a stance of expectation taken to God, which requires faith, but is not itself faith. And the more interesting question, is to what extent hope is therefore also a stance that one assumes toward the self. I think that's the way I would think about it. And the reason why a stance that one assumes towards God can also be described as a stance that one is assuming toward the self is because in some fundamental way, the truest understanding or truth about the self is that the self become Christ. And Christ is human, but Christ is divine, hence God. So that's what I would say for Dante. I don't know, again, I have no idea what the truth is. I'm just saying what Dante thinks, I think. What I think Dante thinks.
So on that hope question, I guess I have a question about that too. At the end, how you kept saying he's asking how, it just makes me think of that desire for intellectual satisfaction. And that's what I remember in reading the Paradiso, that it concluded, and I just felt like that was the culmination, is having that complete, he had a moment or a flash of like it all made sense for a moment. And that's what we have to look forward to. Is that, would you put hope and intellectual satisfaction together? And can I ask one more thing? Sorry, I'm also wondering if, you put in Paul and Dante together?
Oh, yeah.
Was he influenced?
Paul went to heaven too.
What's that?
Paul went to heaven too.
Yeah, very good. Right. Was he influenced by any other mystical writers? Because I feel like it's the mystical writers who have all talked about this intellectual satisfaction too. I think. I can't remember which ones or what, but so there you go.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, no, these are, when you start talking about intellectual satisfaction in Dante, it starts getting really difficult to talk about, because there is a sense in which, certainly in some of Dante's earlier works, you might say that if anything, he's too into intellectual satisfaction, as though obviously that just is what the best thing is. Now, I'm not saying that it's not. I'm just saying that there's a tendency in Dante in the Commedia, to, on the one hand, still be pushing that line. And yet, on the other hand, and the example of Ulysses actually comes to mind here, right? Ulysses is someone who is pursuing knowledge and pursuing the highest truth. And the interesting thing about Ulysses, and this is linked to the Vittorio Montemaggi's recent book, is that Ulysses understands intellectual satisfaction in relation to truth as requiring a loss of the human. So Ulysses aims to arrive at the land where there are no people. Right? He leaves his wife, his father, his son. He aims to just leave everything. It's as though, in order for Ulysses will lose his humanity in the truth that he will somehow know or become. The interesting thing about the last moment in the comedy is that you might read it as Dante is looking for a principle. He's looking for some kind of insight that will help him figure the problem out, right? To square the circle of the incarnation. What comes to him in a flash is that the solution to the puzzle, the thing that allows him to sort of know its truth, is nothing other than his human self. So it's an experiential knowledge, I would say, where in that flash, it's Dante become Christ. And that explains why there's an effect of that union which lasts after the vision, right? Already by desire and will were turned like a wheel move evenly. The thought is that that affective state that Dante has after the vision is over is the result of the vision, but actually lasts longer. In fact, if Mary has anything, if Mary always gets what she wants, and she does, I think, then then the poem, again, I'm just saying what the poem says, the poem basically makes the claim that that affective state lasts for the rest of Dante's life. Because Bernard asks Mary that she preserve in him the affections that are the result of the final vision. And those are the affections. So Sorry, I talk way too much. Maybe two more. We should have two. Can we have two more? No. I'll try to just come back two more.
So I have kind of a, I don't know, maybe a sad question. So you mentioned how Dante requires a desire in order to reach like beatitude, and that in Dante that comes about when he says, "Except that my mind was struck in a flash by which this desire came," and this flash is something that's given to him through Mary, and that he can't achieve on his own.
I don't think so.
So I guess I'm just wondering whether in a way in Dante is the difference between the damned and the blessed kind of the arbitrary distribution of grace by Mary?
No.
Okay.
No. The difference between if you really want to get down to brass tacks, the difference between the damned and the not damned is that the damned have no hope. Now, how can that be analyzed? Well, a condition for hope is an openness to something other than what one is now. Hope requires an openness to a possible self, which is yourself, which is nonetheless other than the self that you are experiencing right now, unless anyone's having a beatific vision. The central feature of those who are damned is that they are unwilling to let go of the self as they understand it, as a result of history and actions and the past. Hope requires a willingness to let go of the self-conception you have of yourself now. If you're not willing to let go of the self-conception you have of yourself, you shut yourself off to hope. And this, in fact, may be, at least in the poem, this may be the particular tragedy of the perfectly virtuous pagan souls in limbo, which is, in Virgil's case, right, it would be an unwillingness to imagine that Virgil's true self, could be something other than what Virgil understands himself to be. I mean, this is another way of saying that they have no conception of the incarnation. Virgil has no conception that his self could be Christ. So, I mean, Mary does a lot. Hell, I think Beatrice is praying for Virgil right now. So maybe Virgil's already let go of his old self. Okay, I guess, no.
You're not quite off the hook. I have one question for you.
Oh.
I get to do this because I have the microphone. I loved what you were saying at the ending there, and if we didn't know, those of you who were in my Augustine seminar, if you didn't know that he was talking about Dante, he could have very well been talking about Augustine right there, right?
You just want to one-up the Dante
Yeah.
lecture by saying it's all
So
Augustine.
this was all ripped off from Augustine. No,
clever.
that's not the point.
Sorry.
But so I just want to ask you to make even more explicit, or maybe help unpack for me something that's very much implicit in what you're saying. You've said it already. So first of all, I love this line, hope only gets into hell from the outside. And I connected that back to the beginning where Dante has no hope for himself, you said. It's the people that love him that have hope for him. And so I guess I'm just wondering, are you basically suggesting there's a kind of analogy to be made between the way in which we let others suggest to us the possibilities of who and what we are, and the way in which we let Christ suggest to us the possibilities of who and what we are? That in both cases, the meaning of our lives, the meaning of what we are, rests in the care of others and isn't something that we have great access to ourselves.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
I think that's absolutely the case. I think that, again, Dante does not know the truth about himself
Right.
at the beginning of the poem. I don't think he knows the truth about himself, again, until that final vision.
Right.
Virgil does not know the truth about himself.
Right.
I don't think.
Right.
Virgil, oh, sorry, Jessica.
You can just take it off.
Virgil.
Virgil doesn't know.
Virgil is unlike Cato again. So Virgil has this really interesting encounter with Cato, who is a pagan senator who commits suicide, but actually he understands his suicide as a sacrifice for the nation. So he's very Christ-like, and actually, in Dante's thought, he functions basically like Moses. He's like the bad cop leading the souls up the mountain, which are just like Moses in the desert. Okay, and the difference between them is that Cato talks about how when he was released by Christ, the new law that was made there was such that nothing in his past could move him any longer. And this is a reference to his wife, okay? Because Virgil appeals to her to get Cato to do what Virgil wants. And it's not as though Cato doesn't love his wife. I think Cato probably loves his wife more perfectly now than he did then. But it's that he has let go completely of the self that he understands as constructed from his history up into the point that he was saved. And the condition of moving forward is letting go of what one has already done. And Virgil is actually quite proud of what he's done and doesn't want to let go of it. Or you could make that argument. So not until you know yourself perfectly are you really in a position to know yourself. Right? And to know yourself perfectly is to know yourself like in and as, in some sense, God knows you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Junker.